Well, thank you for the invitation, for flying me literally across the world. I'm not sure if I could have gone to a more far-flung space. Obviously, I'm a bit jet lagged, so I'll be a little bit more scattered than usual. I'm actually not a good speaker, though. So I use that as an excuse when I'm traveling. I'm like, I'm all over the place. But I'm really just generally this incoherent at home, too. So in the United States today, I guess the real question that people are debating is there kind of a shift to the left or a shift to the right? And the optimists among us can point to the growth of left groups like DSA and the far more significant support for Bernie Sanders. So 13 million people voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary. Many more indicated their support for him in the caucuses and other things too. And of course, the more dour among us can remind everyone that the right is emboldened, and of course, Trump was the one who actually won the 2016 election. I think suffice to say, we could just take a less definitive approach and just say that this is a period in which establishment politics have proven themselves bankrupt for a lot of people, and people are looking for alternatives, or are just kind of dropping out of engaging and doing the things they normally do, like vote for the Democratic Party or turn out for elections. It's really a time when the norms that have stood for decades are eroding. And the outcome, whether it'll benefit the right primarily or the left primarily, is still undetermined, which I think is at the very least a situation that's better than the situation in some parts of Europe, for example, where it's pretty clear at this point that the populist right is in the driver's seat and is the prime beneficiary of the last 10 years. I think in the US, things are more indeterminate. So to begin with, it's worth pointing out that Trump doesn't really have a mandate. I feel like I'm doubling down and sticking to my guns because I swore to even a few people in the room before the 2016 election that Trump only had like a 1% chance of winning. And I don't think I discredited myself. I think I was correct. Just, 1% isn't 0%. But he won by the narrowest of margins. He kind of fluked his way in the White House, partially on the basis of just a very Byzantine, unusual, electoral system that we have in the U.S. And his support has actually continued to erode ever since. He's constantly embattled with not just the media and all the other kind of cultural apparatuses stacked against him, but also there's a real popular base of people that don't like him. Even people that don't identify themselves with the left in any way or shape. And I think it didn't necessarily have to be this way. Trump's position coming out of the 2016 election was a contradictory one, and he's resolved things in a way that should bring some relief to those of us on the left. So in other words, he had to try to reconcile the populist promises of his campaign, for example, promises for infrastructure spending, his criticism of the established kind of post-war U.S. order, which was linchpinned by two things in particular, a network of kind of free trade arrangements and also U.S. support for NATO. So he seemed to be challenging some of those things during his campaign, but he had to reconcile the more populist and more unusual parts of his campaign with the traditional business interests that Republicans rely on, which are, of course, free trade. They wanted tax cuts. They were very wary of deficit spending, and so on. So you could say that there was a battle between the Steve Bannon kind of right populist wing of the Republican Party and the Paul Ryan one. And Bannon has since been removed from the administration, and Trump's crowning achievement is tax cuts. So the few tariffs, by the way, that he's recently slapped on tariffs on imported steel and aluminum, these aren't very popular. And also in general, just because the issue can be confusing, like free trade is sometimes good and in the interest of workers. Sometimes in certain contexts, certain forms of protectionism might be too, but this is a particularly kind of useless and not very and counterproductive in any standpoint form of action that has very little support among either unions, ordinary people, or business interests. So there was a real danger, though, that even though Trump wasn't elected with a wide base, he relied on actually a base that was very much like a lot of traditional right-of-center governments. I mean, a lot of them were kind of petty bourgeois. It was a very white base, but it was still like a middle-class base. So, in other words, sometimes in the media, your popular depiction of what an average Trump voter would look like might be like just a downtrodden, kind of slightly embittered white worker, but it's more likely like a middle manager at a hardware store or something. And he was really elected because a lot of the people that traditionally turned out to vote for the Democrats didn't turn out to vote for Hillary Clinton. So Black and Latino workers, in particular, turnout was down, and there was some actually attrition, some limited support. So Democrats have been predicting that historic levels of Black support for Obama would be turnout would be down in the Black community, but they thought it would be made up for in among Latinos. It wasn't. A lot of white workers that voted for Obama twice did not vote for Hillary Clinton. Of course, the reason given in the media for this is that they're racist. But there was really the chance that Trump could have developed the base through things like a deficit spending fueled jobs program, for instance. So, Bannon's line was, money is cheap. You could just borrow a bunch of money from China, create a big jobs and infrastructure program. And he thought that would yield, support even among minority communities that traditionally don't vote Republican. So I guess what Bannon was factoring in was that, the level of Trump support in the Black community is like less than 20%. If that even got up to 30% on the basis of just, giving deprived communities access to employment through a jobs program, that would be enough to really take a coalition that's like 45% and make it into a majoritarian one, which is actually, I think, smart. And we should rebel against parts of the left's almost essentialism that just assumes that because of demographic facts, young people or people of color or whatnot, that they'll never vote for a right-of-center candidacy. And especially in an era when center-left parties aren't really offering people anything constructive or positive or useful, that's always a danger. Luckily for us, the Trump administration has just pursued basically the business part of the Republican agenda. So he's chose Paul Ryan, not Steve Bannon. He's just done so in a very unusual way, very kind of gaffe-prone way, he's a way with words, as people know. Though it's not quite as unusual as people think. I grew up in New York, and I have a lot of friends from Queens who kind of have some Trumpism. Like everything's amazing, and it's not that unusual. So I think it's hard to imagine today, given the way things are going, given how low Trump's approval ratings are historically low. It's hard to imagine a more favorable condition for resistance. But we shouldn't underestimate the ability of U.S. liberalism to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So the Democratic Party, it's worth noting, isn't really a party in a traditional sense that we see parties emerge in other countries. So it's not a membership-based organization. Primaries in the U.S. are conducted by the state. If I decided tomorrow to become a Republican, I could start say I'm a communist Republican, and it would be literally impossible for the Republican Party to kick me out. It would actually, the only way if I was disenfranchised, just generally, but by the state. So it's not a party that calls protests, as unusual as that is. So Hillary Clinton is like kind of the leader of a hashtag resistance, but she's not speaking on the streets. It's not. There was no. I mean, it's a telling thing that she won the popular vote by millions of votes, but there was no kind of rallies on the streets calling for her to be instituted as president. There was none of that. But things like the Women's March were a promising start to the Trump era. Millions were participating in that march and in kind of surrounding events that never engaged in mass politics before, and it was truly, spontaneous to begin with. But even though the initial leadership was organic, due to the structure of U.S. politics, the polls from the beginning were in a kind of NGO direction, uncritical of the Democratic Party in general and Clinton in particular. So in other words, I'm not saying that these movements were kind of created from the top by the Democratic Party. I think they were very much organic, but just given our party structure, given what politics are in the US, they just kind of naturally drifted in this direction. On the other hand, there was also the airport protests and all these other kind of spontaneous movements in defense of immigration rights and refugees and whatnot. These followed the more classic dilemma of good spontaneous movements, but without kind of a coherent organizational whole. You can't really sustain struggle and continue it on. So that's a common story, of course, everywhere around the world. But there seemed to be, at the very least, a real realization, even among established Democratic Party, that things had to change. There was a quote by one prominent Democratic Party official right after the election, and he said, "If you want to appeal to the manufacturing worker in Scranton, a kind of industrial or formerly industrial area in Pennsylvania, the college student in Los Angeles, and the single mom making minimum wage in Harlem, one economic message will work." That was what the Democratic Party was saying, and it came from Chuck Schumer, a New York senator who's basically known as like the most kind of opportunist person in the party. Like, he's a right-wing figure in the party, but now he's saying things like that. But he's a good bellwether of the broader climate, because he'll kind of move in any direction. But it's a far cry from what he was saying just 2 months before the election. And this was his quote: "For every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania, we will pick up 2 moderate Republicans in the suburbs in Philadelphia." And you could repeat that in Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So this is literally the same person 2 months apart. So the Democratic Party, we don't have time to go into the structure of it, but it's a social liberal party, but with labor within its tent. So U.S. politics is basically what, let's say, UK politics would be like if the liberals maintained their hegemonic, kind of position, and instead the independent. Well, you guys are from Australia. I don't know why I think that it would be more relevant for me to bring up an example of UK politics. I'll just move on. But it's a social liberal, not a social democratic party. I see your flag. You have the Union Jack on it. So for a while, though, after in the post-war period, just like a lot of social democratic parties abroad, the Democrats could promise workers a fair share of a growing pie. But with the resolution of the crisis in the 1970s, at best what they could do is marry social inclusion with neoliberalism. So, like in my family, for instance, we all vote, like literally everyone in a very large extended family, 50 people, all 50, vote Democrat, because the Republicans have this, this white nationalist mystique to it. It really is like a very hard right party for a center right party of government. So it has something. There's been some advances, of course, in social struggles and the struggle against racism and all these other things. And the Democratic Party has been able to speak to those changes and kind of obviously pushed by social movements, adopt progressive views in certain social issues. But it's been marrying this rhetoric of social inclusion and diversity with essentially neoliberal politics, not too different than the Republican Party. Just like a lot of center-left parties and centrist parties, the Democrats are just basically saying, we'll cut less than the alternative, or it'll be death by kind of 1,000 small cuts instead of one big offensive. Now, Bernie Sanders offered an alternative model. And you could look at Bernie Sanders' program and say, oh, this is just a social democratic program. The reason why it was different, it was kind of a class struggle social democracy. It was based on an antagonism. His message was very simple to people. It's, you work hard and you deserve more. And the reason why you don't have enough isn't because of immigrants or minorities or other scapegoats. It's because of millionaires and billionaires. So the classic rhetoric there is it's a rhetoric that you would expect from someone who was first politicized through the socialist movement, who has that background. And even some Democrats, like I quoted Schumer before, thought that even if this wasn't politically desirable, then at the very least it was a viable political route to rebuild the party. So it was a classic, many of them wanted to do the classic thing that center-left parties elsewhere in the world do is, when you're in opposition, you tack left. But then, over time, this kind of resistance to Trump, and, we'll use that scare quotes around it half the time, began blaming kind of its own scapegoats, like the role of the FBI in the election, which is fine, fair. FBI, is a terrible institution, and especially now Russia, and so everything has kind of devolved in this very legalistic, constitutional mode. So multiple people have made the comparisons with Italy, and it kind of failed. Resistance against Berlusconi was very much moved in this legalistic way. It tried to use portions of the media against him, and he himself, governed basically like a traditional right-wing, neoliberal, but with a level of buffoonery. So it actually fits well on both sides. So I do think, and I will double down, in 2020, I think Trump will be defeated, but 99.5% chance this time. But even if this tactic, this kind of anyone but Trump, this kind of anti-Trump rhetoric is enough to defeat the candidate Donald Trump in 2020, it won't be enough to defeat Trumpism. And I don't think Trumpism is necessarily an ideology of the far right, but you could be worried about the rise of a far right once this populist right governing movement is out of power. You can imagine the forces that it'll unleash. So I'll just wrap up with a few glimmers of hope on the left, and I'll let Jeff kind of elaborate more. There's of course DSA. When I joined a decade ago, it had 5,000 members and a median age in the 60s. It's now halved its median age, and it has 35,000 members. And I think that's of interest to the left, but at the moment, it's generally still a fringe development in a country of 330 million people. But we shouldn't underestimate how much mobilizational capacity even small groups in the left can have in areas where unions and mass parties have been hollowed out. So in other words, with 3,000 members in New York City, DSA can mobilize more people at a protest than a trade union of 60, 70,000 people. So more importantly, I'll let Jeff get into this, is the recent upsurge of public sector unionism, particularly in areas like West Virginia and Oklahoma. These coincidentally are areas, or not coincidentally, are areas with weak trade union bureaucracies. The West Virginia strike was a illegal wildcat strike. It's quite unprecedented. Socialists did play a role within that strike, and there are attempts through DSA, through what the ISO and others are doing to build this kind of militant minority that we need through cadre building and then strategic interventions. It's obviously a little bit of a different, how we have to approach it within DSA, because it's an organization that anyone could just join online. So we kind of have to find people and create institutions and politics within this more amorphous tent. So it's a different thing, but similar aim. There's consensus on some parts of DSA and the wider left that a lot of the focus for us should be on K through 12 education workers, on nurses, on logistics workers. On the first two fronts, especially among teachers, but also to some degree in the nurses unions, there's been a lot of progress. The logistics thing is just something we say and need to put into practice, but it does seem like a strategic sector for the future. But West Virginia, I think, was a vindication of worker struggle at the disruptive core of left politics. These are people positioned with the social weight to lead a wider transformation. So of course, everybody in a moral and ethical sense have social value, but for those of us in professions like journalism or students or whatnot, what we do by nature, we're less strategic for the left because we have a much smaller disruptive capacity. And this used to be common sense across all forms of the left, from reformist to revolutionary left, even a few decades ago, and it's kind of been lost. And I think these strikes are always periodic reminders of what just 10, 20,000 people can do, reshaping the politics of an entire state. And finally, I'll wrap up by saying that, today Bernie Sanders' stance is becoming a little bit more iffy. And I say this as the biggest Bernie Sanders, apologist on the broad left, even among like your average Our Revolution type. I say no bad words about Bernie Sanders. But he's still the most popular politician in the country. Health willing, he will be running in 2020. But he's been forced to ingratiate himself with the Democratic establishment. He's aping certain kinds of rhetoric. And it's less because he's trying to position himself so much as there was a void. And he's now just seen as like even though he's not technically in the Democratic Party, he's seen as kind of the leadership or part of the leadership of a wing of the Democratic Party. And that does mean that he may be losing the anti-establishment appeal that he once had. That's just my guess for 2020. If you look at polling, his favorability is as high as ever. There's a lot of efforts like Our Revolution and a lot of other efforts among these kind of Bernie-crats. These are more electoral efforts to kind of elect liberal left city council people and other seats. I think the stance of the left should be to not combat or even necessarily directly criticizes and you should not be doing this, but to kind of stay on the outside of these efforts. But I would just say that West Virginia does and the struggles to come in Oklahoma and elsewhere are the most significant developments in the labor movement in a generation, and they show where our orientation primarily should be, and that's within the labor movement in particular, because the labor movement is not just another social movement. It's the foundation of core of any working class politics, and I really think there's going to be a way forward shown in the next few months through these upsurges.